I'm grateful to the library for giving me this opportunity today to return to a subject that's been a great interest of mine for many years now. Llyfr Aneurin, or Cardiff Manuscript 282, is a Welsh manuscript of the later 13th century, probably from North Wales. You've heard about its coming here just now, so I won't repeat that. It's a small manuscript, about 5 by 7 inches, or about 128 by 166 millimeters. There are 38 pages. It once had 48 pages. No copy survives from before the time when 4 pages were torn out and 6 pages were cut out of the manuscript. The remaining pages are full of text in Welsh. Most have 22 lines. It is almost all poetry. 1,480 verse lines are in Ivor Williams' 1938 edition, Canu Aneurin. That's almost 10,000 words, in which Llyfr Aneurin names scores of people and places and mentions or alludes to many events. However, the poetry has one recurrent central story, though it never actually relates it as a story. It seems to be as follows. 300 noble warriors gathered at a place called Dyn Aidan, which is now widely recognized to be Edinburgh. Dyn Aidan belonged to a country and a tribe called Gododdin. After hospitality shared at Dyn Aidan, the 300 men attacked as a mounted force a place called Cartwright, which is now widely recognized as being Catterick in Yorkshire, probably the Roman fort there. In the battle, many were killed on both sides. Most of the verses in Llyfr Aneurin are elegies for the men on Gododdin's side who fell at Cartwright. Within the verses, the poet names himself once as Aneurin. He's mentioned also elsewhere in the manuscript. His attitude, as most modern readers now understand it, is consistently that he was a contemporary of the heroes. He knew them personally. He was at Dyn Aidan. Very few of the people named in Llyfr Aneurin are known from other sources. However, the historical circumstances best suit the mid-6th century. The northernmost Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Branach or Bernicia, does not seem to have existed yet. At least it played no role when Gododdin attacked Cartwright. Llyfr Aneurin contains 3 partially overlapping versions of the same collection of verses. The longest version was by a scribe we call A. That probably wasn't his actual name. It is the most easily intelligible version and contains the well-known series of 10 audlau or stanzas, each beginning with the line Gwir a aeth Cartwright, the men who went to Catterick, and variants of that. Scribe B, also not his name, supplied a second version of the text, which is more difficult to understand and seems to reflect a more original order of the audlau. The version of the collection, that version of the collection starts with a verse commemorating a battle fought west of Edinburgh in December 642. That Strath Caron Audal is followed by a prologue to the Cartwright elegies, which says, in the prologue it says, that Aneurin was dead at that time, and it implies that the kingdom of Gododdin had ceased to exist. For the first 23 audlau of the B scribe's work, he uses the contemporary Middle Welsh 13th century spelling. Then, beginning with his 24th stanza, B appears to start the collection for a third time. He has another version of the same verse that he had already supplied right after the prologue, when he began his work. In other words, this repeated verse would appear to be the actual beginning of Aneurin's poem, what comes immediately after the prologue introducing Aneurin's poem. From this 24th audal, marked on here on the screen, onward, it's the one with the hole is in the manuscript, onward, he uses a much earlier spelling to the end of the surviving manuscript. B did not know how to modernize Old Welsh into contemporary 13th century spelling, so he just copied letter for letter. As Graham Isaac concluded, B must have had two copies of the text in front of him, a newer one and an older one. So it is B's 24th to 42nd Audlai that represent the most archaic version of a Gododdin, which is most valuable for modern research, and it's also the hardest to understand. It was no doubt hard to understand also in pre-modern times. That is why I suspect Audl B42 breaks off at the bottom of page 38 of the surviving manuscript, the last surviving page of Llyfr Aneurin today. And pages 39 to 48 were long ago removed and put to some other use. It is no exaggeration to say that Llyfr Aneurin represents a great literary enigma. Why does such a thing exist? How is it even possible for events that took place in Lothian and Yorkshire in the 6th century to be recalled in such extensive and incidental detail 700 years later in a book in the Welsh language? And the perspective of the poet, as I said, is as a contemporary to the people and events he describes. A controversy has raged over this enigma for 200 years. Through most of the 20th century, the standard view was a Gododdin is essentially authentic. Gododdin attacked Cartwright, Aneurin composed elegies for the fallen soon afterwards, and through some sort of 700-year process of oral and written transmission, poets and parchment on the move, this 6th century poetry survives in Llyfr Aneurin, the 13th century manuscript now here. This view had the authority of John Morris Jones and Ivor Williams behind it, more recently sustained in the treatments of Kenneth Jackson and A.O.H. Jarman. It is still what you usually get whenever the subjects of Llyfr Aneurin and a Gododdin are introduced. As authoritative as the claim of authenticity has been, it has never won over 100% of the doubters, and more recently, skepticism seems to have the momentum. However, the case for an inauthentic Gododdin only gets so far. To move forward from merely saying, I don't believe it, one must put some meat on the bones of an alternative theory. Someone in, say, 10th century Wales took a notion to compose scores of Audlai in the persona of Aneurin as the first person witness to a distant time and far-off places Gododdin and Cartwright. That poet then drew in masses of collected and invented antiquarian details, most with no plausible Welsh source. Most of the persons and places are not in Historia Brittonum, not in the Welsh Annals, not in the Old Welsh genealogies, not in the Saints' Lives, not in the Triads, not in Culhwch and Olwen, any of the great collections of heroes and personalities and events. This would be a very high literary concept, therefore. And for what? We know of no medieval Welsh person claiming descent from a Gododdin hero, and it is not just the initial effort that we would need to explain, but several Welsh poets thought a Gododdin was important enough to preserve the three different recensions that we have reflected in Llyfr Aneurin now. In other words, the theory of a Gododdin as a medieval meta-literature raises more questions than it answers. My own view, and what I'll try to explain in the rest of this talk, is that the contents of Llyfr Aneurin are more intelligible and the authenticity of a Gododdin more credible once we begin to explore the evidence for history, language, and literary activity in Wales in the 7th century.